as a Christian, my whole life, I thought that this lady named Mary, the mother of Jesus, literally, notice I use the word literally, was impregnated by God. And that was what I believed. I creedal Christian type. Never really put too much thought into it critically. I did think, what are the Roman Catholics doing? Cut the crap. She was a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus, but she had sex with Mary or with Joseph not long after that. And I think Matthew says after that he knew her or something, which is kind of like he was with her. That's what I thought. And then I found out that other men in history had like gods impregnate their moms. And I'm like, come on, man. Like, this is pretty big deal. Like, what's going on here? So Jesus is obviously the only person who was ever like divinely birthed in history, right?
Well, no.
Really?
Yeah. You might be surprised to learn that there are several of those. Now, this isn't parallelomania. This is the reality of the ancient world. This is how, like I've been arguing all along, this is how you install someone in the Hall of Fame. This is how you give them that extra credibility to rule, to be regarded. Lots of times you find this in foundation myths or foundation stories. Kings end up being divinely parented. They're demigods in that way. Was this an ontologically real kind of story? No. This was a custom that went on for generations and centuries, and you could find it in countless individuals. I catalog, I don't know, like 50 or something like that in my book, and I was just getting started. And so, and so I've got sired by Zeus, a whole bunch of these, Achilles, Athleus, Alexander, Amphion, Argus, Pelasgus, Castor, Corinthus. Corinthus, by the way, is the founder of the city of Corinth, was a demigod sired by Zeus. He had one human parent and one divine. And so I could go on and on and on. The list is any number. It's kind of a who's who, and there's a lot of people that you don't even know. There were just rulers and kings of various places and times throughout the Hellenistic and Roman world that were elevated with this kind of story embellishment. They were, divinely parented. One, the key is that you've got one God that is a parent that is God, and another that is mortal. And so normally that's going to be a male God and a female mortal, but the opposite also happens with some of the female deities. And so
let me paint this another way. You're probably not used to having things thrown at you like this, but I had a conversation, again, I mentioned in one of our videos before with Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy is what he goes by, and other Christians who just, you can tell they have disdain for what I'm saying when I say like, okay, I read Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars on the Divine Augustus, and I love the story, and I will get it out and read it to them. And like be reading the portents leading up to this man's life and his birth and his father, his real father, according to the story, is Apollo. Okay. And like, it's in the shape of a snake and and I'm like, dude, that's a cool story. I'm not going to lie. Like the eagle comes down and steals the food out of his hand and then realizes who he just took the food from, turns back around and comes and returns the food back to him. Yeah. Hey man, I'm sorry, dude. And later on, it's the same thing. An eagle's taking them off to heaven. So I'm throwing this at you just to say, like, is it wrong of me? Do you honestly think it's wrong of me to see that Jesus's birth in that narrative, which we have two different kinds of narratives, by the way, but a narrative of a divine birth, both are doing it, is smack dab in the middle of my walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck thing?
It would have been unmistakable. It's now one of the things that is different is that it's immaculate, so to speak, or the Catholics call it that. It's an asceticized version of it. It's not Zeus's dalliances out, trying to get with women and this sort of thing. And the early Christian criticized some of that. And even the philosophers that had nothing to do with Christianity were criticizing some of those stories on those grounds because of the emerging ascetical philosophies of the time through Platonism and so forth. So that's going on. And Christians are registering within that marketplace of ideas, their hero, in their way. but it's not different in kind or in meaning in that way. And so it might be cleaned up, sanitized or whatever in terms of, it's not an X-rated situation. But at the same time, though, it signals the exact same thing. So
just because she didn't have sex in this act, that ultimately makes no difference of what kind of narrative this is.
That is correct. And so, in fact, we can go the predecessor to the Augustus myth. And by the way, Augustus, it's funny because you get this wild little story at the beginning that's kind of like this decorative little gem at the beginning. Very, very literary, very, very mythical, very, very, and you could see, and all of a sudden the modality changes in the text to this mundane figure that's described in very human terms for more or less. It's still exalted in some ways, but
he still makes mistakes though.
You could see Augustus was a real guy, you know, we're not, but I don't think anyone's losing sleep over the idea that maybe he was divinely parented. I don't think there's anybody taking that seriously, and for good reason. We're rational people, at least we're supposed to be. That rationality goes out the window as soon as we get to Christianity for whatever reason. These are sacred stories and there's a whole history behind that, as we all know. But we need to be honest with ourselves, and so Augustus had as his predecessor Alexander the Great. So if you go back to the divine birth myth of Alexander, that was the greatest name of that time of a historical figure. You couldn't get any more exalted than Alexander. The Caesars all were competing with his legacy. His shadow over the Hellenistic East covered the entirety of it. And so that looming figure was always in the minds of people, especially anywhere you had the idea of ruling, conquering, being a successful leader, this kind of thing. And so everyone was, fashioning, you were measured against Alexander, and imitating Alexander was the way to power in that world. And so Augustus knew that, and that divine birth myth echoes some of the motifs that you get with Alexander's divine birth myth. Now, what I do in the book, I have an excursus where I go and say, not only is Matthew's text like that, but it mimetically is meant to follow that narrative. And so I take it a step further and say, it's deliberate. You've got the most famous guy and this guy that's not even known. And that's one of the things we need to get back to also, is that Jesus was a nobody in that world. There were a lot of big people and big personalities, but when Christianity came on the scene, he was unknown. There was nothing there. And we project back onto his equal significance with everyone else. But that was not at all established at that point. And so so he's competing, and he's the stories, the narratives that people are producing are in competition and trying to leverage some of those larger cultural capital forms that were already in the marketplace at that time. And so to mimetically follow Alexander, there's not much more you can do to be more Hellenistic than that. Once you get to Matthew's divine birth myth, though, and that's a comparative study that I have in the book that I offer as almost like a bonus, I guess. Studying all in its own right, really. You really get to the bottom of what's going on there. You also have a virgin birth with Alexander. It's told a little differently, but I follow a variety of mimetic signals. And if you like, I could read it to you.
Sure.
Yeah. Let me read a section here. So this is from Plutarch. He's writing about Alexander's life here, and he's a Greek writer, a Middle Platonist, so to speak. Let me read a little bit of it. So that Alexander, with regard to his lineage, on his father's side, was a descendant of Heracles through Caranus, and on his mother's side was a descendant of Icus through Neoptolemus, is among those things entirely trusted. It is said that Philip, after being initiated into the mysteries of Samothrace, together with Olympias, and while he was but a youth and an orphan, fell in love with her and so betrothed her. Having persuaded her mother Arambus, then the night before they were to consummate the marriage, the bride thought, while there was lightning, that thunderbolt had fallen upon her womb. Okay? Mm-hmm. No one's having sex. That it had fallen upon her womb, From the blow, a fire was ignited. Thereby, as it broke into flames, the fire scattered in all directions. Later, after the wedding, Philip saw himself in a dream placing a signet, a stamp, like a ring, impression on his wife's womb. Hadn't been opened. The emblem of the signet, as it seemed, had an image of a lion. In other words, she's still a virgin. While the other diviners were distrusting the vision, namely that they needed a more careful guard of Philip, of those who had attended the wedding, Aristander and Talmesas, said that she had conceived a man. For nothing seals those things that are empty, and that she conceived a child who was courageous and as a lion by nature. There then appeared a serpent as Olympias slept, stretched out alongside her body. They say that this most of all quenched Philip's love and fondness of her, such that with her he did not often have sexual relations as he lay with her, either because he feared that some of his wife's spells and enchantments may come upon him, or because he avoided the curse of intercourse, since she was joined to one greater than himself. Okay, so they had avoided intercourse up to that point.
Right.
Married, and then he had, relations with her. But basically, that's the story. Now, let me lay out. Now, this feels like it's different, right? Mm-hmm. Doesn't feel like a carbon copy, right, from Matthew. But let me lay out the similarities. So, a parental genealogical description placed at the beginning aimed at signifying the respective hero via an established pedigree. A betrothed juvenile couple who are in love. The interruption by the deity of the wedding betrothal process, impregnating the bride through his signature principal element, namely Zeus's thunderbolt of fire and Yahweh's sacred wind, Pneuma. The virginal conception and birth of the hero child, the surrogate father abstains from sexual relations until the womb is opened through the birth of the child, namely the breaking of the seal or the signet. Drama over the sexual fidelity of the bride and legitimacy of the conception. Like, was it really divine or what? There's a little bit of that question mark brought up in Matthew. Distrust of the woman's account of the child's conception, understandably, precipitating the need for the groom's divine dream, thus restoring confidence in the bride's story. A prophetic description of the child given in the groom's dream, establishing supreme expectation regarding the destiny of the child, and a later association with magic, though differently expressed in the two narratives. In fact, in both narratives, you have Magi in the divine birth myth and I document this, that there are Magi that report that a great one has been born and this kind of thing. And that's the same thing that you get in the Gospels, in Matthew, actually. And so the Magi herald that and it's interesting because the Magi were from Parthia, the East. They were the, magicians, so to speak. They were not under the same sort of, staunch Jewish, paradigm. And so you could see in Matthew a broader kind of metaphysical world that is more encompassing of the Levant generally and not just Judaism. So you got Iranomancy, that is dream divination, going on quite a bit. You have, the invocation of Magi, which, I don't know how comfortable anyone that's a Christian today, if they're conservative in any way, could be with that. The Magi were basically sorcerers in the ancient world. They weren't Jewish at all. And so, and yet they're going to the birth too. That's something important to them. And so it's broadening the appeal, saying this is metaphysically not so contained as you might think. Other traditions, other religions, it's reconciling them into this kind of picture in Matthew.
So there was a dream to the husband on both?
Yes.
Okay, so this is really interesting. I'd love to go read the whole full-on, not just what you wrote, but go and dig deeper, because I wondered if there was an attempt at Alexander's life as a child, because we see that in Matthew, but it may not need to be, because what I find interesting is there's this invocation to Moses' narrative, which that the Pharaoh's trying to kill the newborn children with Herod, but I see Suetonius. So if I could pull up the source right now, I would, but I didn't have Suetonius on me.
Yeah.
Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars, the Divine Augustus chapter, paragraph 94. I know the paragraph by heart now. I don't have it memorized, but in it, he goes to explain that there's a lightning bolt that strikes this wall of Ætae.
Yeah.
The people of Ætae start war with Rome, thinking this is like evidence they're going to win. They're almost to their own destruction. They stop and realize, okay, cognitive dissonance, whatever, if you want to like rationalize what they're doing.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Maybe he's just going to come from our town. We need to stop this with Rome. And then it says that his mother, like that year, that they did not want to raise up or rear up their kids. So they did not write them in the thing of the Senate, because the Senate did not want children to be born that year. You can't get any more explicit than the Roman Suetonius saying the Senate was going to kill your child for being born that year, because they were afraid that a ruler, a king, was going to come, because you know how the Senate is about kings. They're not a fan of them. And so like, I'm thinking that's interesting. Suetonius has the same trope of the child's birth and needing to kill that child, just like Matthew has kill that child.
Yeah.
Moses has this in his story.
Kill that child, yeah.
I wondered if Alexander had
And
this.
even Raglan he even says something along those lines in his own, treatment of that.
So I just didn't know if Alexander himself, but he may or may not have that specific element.
Yeah, so there are other points of contact with Alexander. For instance, when they come from the east, the Magi, they give proskinesis, that is veneration. They bow, they bend the knee. This was cardinal importance to Alexander. If you go back and read the narratives, he had his own mythographer kind of following him around, building him as greater than, above human, and Callisthenes. And basically, in these narratives, you have, this is a big deal for him. And if you're going to rule in the Persian East, you need proskinesis. You need people bowing to you as a divine figure. And so this is kind of veneration and worship and this sort of thing. And so when they come and bring their gifts and all that to meet with him, they also do proskinesis there. And so proskinesis is super important in Matthew's gospel. It's also important to make ties to Egypt. In Alexander's career, he ends up at Siwa, and so part of his divination is kind of confirmed there in so many ways. And to make Jesus also have ties with Egypt. I know that's a loose part of the argument. It's the very, very end of it. But to me, after you see all of the other evidence, to try and Matthew trying to make a tie into Egypt in that way, in terms of the way he's presenting his divine king that he's crafting in his narrative, to me, it feels like, that also belongs there, as, he's trying to create those associations in order to invoke the Alexander myth.
Was it, this is completely hip shot here.
Yeah.
Was it Alexander, or was it Octavian, or one of these guys who went to Egypt because of the death of his father? And then one of the Egyptian priests corrected him and said, no, remember who your real father is, and it's a god, or something in one of those stories. I don't know, but it makes me think of Egypt. Egypt seems to be this hub of like proof of divination all the damn time. So is this a signal? I can't read Matthew's mind, but it's like, did he go to Egypt just so that I could say, I called my son out of Egypt? Or did he go to Egypt and they're using biblical stuff to kind of try to...
What's hard to get into people's minds is just how important this kind of a narrative would have been for, the divine birth of Alexander, or even Augustus for that matter. These were well-circulated stories. This isn't just one author in the corner writing this. These were the most important big stories of the day that people were looking at. This was the big literature of the time. These are the sources that people were reading, and it was it's pretty consistent that they decorate him in this way, and the towering figure of Alexander would have loomed heavy over these texts. If you wanted to present or produce a king in literature, there's no better way than to try and say, hey, guess what? He's dressed up like Alexander. He's got, he's the new Alexander, Neos Alexandros. This is what we're looking at. This is, in order to even qualify for the job, you had to have that. You had to be festooned in that way. And so different rulers did it in different ways, but it's not surprising to me to see Matthew doing that with his divine king.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope you liked my dad, Richard Miller, in this interview. Remember to like and subscribe. And never forget, we are MythVision.